Okay, everybody, this is part 2 of the motivation and emotion lecture. And today we're going to talk about hunger, sex, and motivation in quote unquote real life. So, hunger is a regulatory drive, right? It's a drive that motivates you to reduce hunger by eating so that you can feel satiated. One thing that's important to note about the hunger drive is that it has a very strong evolutionary history, right? We've evolved very strong mechanism for hunger, more so than the being satisfied mechanism, the satiety mechanism, because across our evolutionary history, right, being hungry was much more common and much more dangerous, and so um, we have very strong mechanisms for hunger more so than for being satisfied. So even if we're satisfied, we're and only a tiny bit hungry, that drive might cause us to snack, even if we don't quote unquote need the calories, right? So hunger is a very strong drive that has very deep evolutionary roots because it has kept us alive this whole time. There are very specific neural and hormonal control of our appetite, of our hunger. We kind of have this built-in hunger thermostat. Normally in class, I would draw it on the board, but I don't have that. But it is covered in your textbook. But essentially, it's a thermostat that interacts between your brain and your body, right? Your brain sends out um, uh, signals to tell your body that you're full when you have enough blood sugar. And your body sends up signals to either say, hey, I'm hungry or I'm full. And so that it's like this loop between your brain and either your stomach and your liver and your kidney to process all of what it is that you're consuming. Oh, sorry. Um, One part of the brain that is very crucial is the hypothalamus, specifically the arcuate nucleus, which has two classes of neurons related to hunger: appetite stimulating, not simulating, appetite stimulating, and appetite suppressing neurons. And these appetite stimulating neurons, when they're fired, will obviously stimulate and increase your appetite, increase your hunger, and appetite suppressing will decrease your hunger. One hormone that is associated with hunger is PYY, or peptide YY. And the function of PYY is to reduce appetite. And so PYY was studied extensively because what they thought that they could do was try to um, put PYY blood into people that are obese or struggling with their weight in order to um, suppress their appetite. But unfortunately, external PYY does not impact people once they consume it. So it has to be organic PYY, meaning endogenous to them, like their body has to make it. And we can look at PYY blood levels compared to obese people, compared to lean, naturally lean people, and we can see that their PYY levels, their natural PYY levels, are significantly lower. So, for example, in this graph, you'll see. Let me get my handy dandy laser pointer. In this graph, you'll see the blood level PYY, right? Low PYY, high PYY. And what they did was they measured PYY 90 minutes before they took these participants out to lunch. And what they found was that the people that were in the obese group had significantly lower PYY levels than people that were in the lean group. But what about after you give them lunch? So you take them to a buffet lunch, and you see that both groups have a sharp increase in PYY levels, but the obese group never quite catches up, right? So the lean group has greater PYY uh, than the obese group, suggesting that people that are obese might be lacking the hormones associated with reduction of appetite. Other uh, chemicals that help us control hunger and appetite are glucose, insulin, and leptin. So, glucose is essentially just your blood sugar. And when your blood sugar is low, your brain essentially tells your body to be hungry, either directly or via the liver, which processes your glucose. Similarly, insulin, not insulin, insulin is a hormone that helps process sugars. And so insulin levels increase when we consume simple sugars, um, but does not increase necessarily when we eat complex sugars, um, which, if you're interested, I think the textbook talks a little bit about diabetes in terms of what happens when insulin levels are off, but we're not going to talk about that here. And then finally, we have leptin. Leptin is a hormone secreted by your body's fat cells. So leptin essentially goes to the brain and acts on an arcuate nucleus in order to reduce appetite. And so uh, you might say then that people that have more fat cells, right, should then be less hungry or have a poor appetite. So if leptin is secreted by fat cells and leptin reduces appetite, the more fat cells you have, the more leptin you have, the lower your appetite should be. Well, one factor in obesity is actually that your body can become desensitized to leptin. So an obese individual does actually have higher than normal levels of leptin, but their body and their brain has become desensitized to its effects. And so similarly to drugs, food can hijack the reward center of the brain in order to make us feel good. And just like drugs, your body can become desensitized to its effect, right? And not surprisingly, sweet and fatty substances are particularly rewarding. Why? As we've discussed earlier on in the semester, because sweet and fatty substances are more likely to keep us alive across evolutionary time. They provide a large boost of calories, and so we've essentially evolved this mechanism to crave sweet and fatty substances because it was more likely to give us calories and fat for long term. One thing that is specific to hunger or this regulatory drive is what we call sensory specific satiety, which is that people and lots of laboratory animals that eat a specific type of food will then experience what we call renewed appetite all of a sudden when a different food or a different taste is placed before them. So let's put it this way. Let's say you go out and you eat this appetizer, right? And you're like, okay, it was nice. I'm still hungry. So you eat a whole steak with creamed spinach and mashed potatoes and sauteed mushrooms, and you are stuffed. Okay. You're stuffed. And I ask you, like, hey, do you want more spinach? Do you want more steak? And you're like, no, I literally cannot eat a single thing. I'm going to die. I can't move. Please stop even offering to me. It sounds terrible, right? If you're really, really full, where you feel like you're like going to explode, and someone says, hey, do you want more of the food that you just ate? It sounds awful. However, if all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, but look, I also made these really cute shot glass drinks, desserts. Do you want one of these? And you're like, yes, please. I'll try one. Give me the pineapple, right? All of a sudden you have this renewed appetite because you're being presented with a new thing, a new food, a new taste, a new texture. And so if I were to give you steak again, you'd be like, oh, this is going to make me sick. But if I give you this strawberry cheesecake shot glass dessert, you're like, yeah, I could do that. I can put that down. I'm full, but that sounds really good. And so all of a sudden they have renewed appetite because they are given this new food. Now, obesity is actually something that's really an issue in the United States. So this is just data up until year 2000. I really need to update it now that I think about it. But this is also the percentage of overweight children. So children over here are considered up until the age of 17. So I understand that it's definitely not, it's teenage years as well. But nonetheless, the curve has gotten drastically steeper. Starting around 1980, and then what we thought was peaking at around 1990 has only served to go up, and about 25% of children around 2000 were obese, and I think the number now is like 33%, which is pretty high given a third of the population of children are obese. Now, the problem of obesity is not easy to solve. The truth is that it's a function of both genetics and nutrition, and its effects on body weight. So within a culture, uh, genetic differences are the primary determinants of who become obese. So if both parents are obese and there's obesity in the family, within a culture, it's more likely to be due to genes rather than eating, because within a culture, lots of people tend to eat similarly. And so it's not that their eating habits don't matter, it's just that genetic differences are probably more impactful. And yes, decreasing food intake and calories does decrease weight. However, decreasing food intake actually activates hunger mechanisms in the brain, right? Because we have that strong hunger drive, which then reduces basal metabolism, because your body, when it's hungry, says, oh, we don't have enough food. We have to lower our metabolism because we're not processing anything, making weight loss actually harder long term unless it is also paired with exercise. So obviously developing good nutrition habits and engaging in regular exercise are among the best techniques that makes it easier to maintain a healthy weight and to lose weight. But it's definitely difficult, especially if you have a genetic predisposition for obesity. Furthermore, some of it might be beyond the control. So I've stressed enough that we have this deep evolutionary drive for hunger. Well, our body essentially sometimes prepares us for the amount of food that it expects to get prenatally. So one study found, or a few studies found, that poor prenatal nutrition, so your nutrition level when you were a fetus, can lead to fetuses developing what we call a thrifty phenotype. A thrifty phenotype is where your body is deciding to store fat because it wants to make sure that it's going to have enough for later. So if you have a poor prenatal environment, you are going to develop this phenotype that's really thrifty and essentially wants to store fat. So let me just visualize that for you. So let's say in utero, during pregnancy, there was famine. And that child that was in the womb, after when it's born, if it experienced famine while it was in the womb, that child is going to have a thrifty phenotype and is more likely to be obese because its body is telling it to store fat for later. If in utero food and nutrition is plentiful, then that leads to a phenotype that says don't store fat, because it assumes, hey, food is plentiful now. That means that it's probably going to be plentiful later. We don't need to store fat. And so sometimes certain genes get turned on and off in order to either store fat or not to store fat. Okay, moving on to sex. When we talk about sex, we will also be talking a little bit about sex, but what we're really talking about is sex hormones and its influence on behavior. So for males, the hormonal influence that's most pronounced is testosterone, right? And testosterone is necessary for developing sexual characteristics of males, such as the testes, changing of the voice, more muscle mass, and really um, the coming online of the endocrine system, which releases testosterone and other hormones across puberty, involves nearly the entire body, right? The hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, which and parathyroid gland, which releases these hormones, adrenals, your pancreas, and then the testicles for males, or ovaries for females. Um, and so testosterone is necessary to maintain uh, the capacity for sex drive, for producing sperm, um, and has very is associated with a host of very specific behaviors, namely aggression, um, and lack of planning in their behavior. If you've ever seen Big Mouth, then you recognize that this is the hormone monster. If you haven't seen the show Big Mouth, highly recommend it. It's on Netflix, but it does a really good job of explaining what puberty is like in adolescence, and the effect of hormones. And it's called the hormone monster, is this guy, because hormones can make, when you first experience them, make you a little atypical, behave atypically. So increased testosterone typically leads to impromptu behaviors, lack of planning, and aggression. Uh, Now, castration does decrease test drive, but it's testosterone that impacts sex drive, not having a penis. And therefore, if you inject this person with testosterone, you can actually have normal sex drive. Not sure why they would want to do that, since they can't necessarily do anything about it. But nonetheless, testosterone is really what is maintaining the capacity for sex drive. For females, sex hormone is estrogen and progesterone. And so, unlike most of uh, the mammalian kingdom that has estrus, um, which is the similar to the menstrual cycle, but estrus is um, when a woman uh, has very high sexual drive, and is the only time when she is sexually active, because it's the only time that she is fertile. So it's very clear when she's fertile, when she's sexually interested, and there's a very tight control between her hormones and her behavior. And there's almost no sexual activity when not fertile, when not in estrus. And removal of the ovaries ceases any and all sexual behavior. There's no sexual behavior for fun or play. The menstrual cycle in humans is very different, because we have two components. Arousability is the ability to become physically aroused. This is actually consistent across the cycle, regardless of when a female is fertile or not. In fact, most human females don't know when they are fertile, because it is not very clear at all. We have hidden fertility. And proceptivity, which is seeking out of sexual activity. So females are more likely to seek out their sexual activity. They're more likely to become sexually aroused without an external other, when fertile, right? So arousability is pretty consistent across the culture. Proceptivity, it increases only when fertile. And estrogen and progesterone, much like testosterone for males, also has these very specific behavioral effects. So this is the hormone monstrous from the show Big Mouth, and again, highly recommend you watching it. But the hormone monstrous, right, it is going to behave in a way that makes the girl act in ways that are atypical, because of hormones. So females, when they first start getting estrogen and progesterone spikes around their adolescent, right before they get their period, all of a sudden start to feel more irritable, more cranky, more impatient, um, just uh, what we used to nickname in my household BSC, batshit crazy, uh, because it was just unexplainable. And eventually the hormones level out, and then you also learn to predict that they're coming, and you're not so crazy all the time. But when you're 12 years old, you don't understand, and therefore these behaviors come online due to the difference in hormones. And now, when we talk about hormones, we really want to talk in sex. We want to talk about sexual differentiation and determinants of sexual orientation, because uh, your sexual orientation or your sexual arrival, right, isn't just when puberty happens. Those are called activating effects, and that's usually what we focus on. So around the time of puberty, we have this awakening of sexual behavior due to these pumping of hormones. But the truth is that most of our life, we've already had differentiating effects of hormones, where before birth, or immediately after birth, we've had certain hormonal exposure that have caused our brain and our hormones in our body to develop in either a more male or a female direction. And so, uh, early presence or absence of testosterone can lead to very specific uh, um, sexual orientation outcomes. So, for example, if you have way too much testosterone in a female fetus, you're much more likely to have a female that is on the LGBTQA spectrum. If you have more testosterone or an absence of, if you have an absence of testosterone or more estrogen in a male fetus, you're much more likely to have a male child that is on the LGBTQA spectrum once they have their activating effects, right? But this has happened throughout their whole lifetime. So one example is CAH, congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is a genetic modification which causes girls to overproduce testosterone. So it's not that someone made them do, right? It's a natural genetic modification. And these females are much more likely to have masculinized genitalia, more aggressive play, prefer to play with boys, prefer to play with boy, quote unquote, like play, like rough and tumble. And they're more likely to report homosexuality and bisexuality once they hit puberty. Now, it's not all, right? So just because a female is producing more testosterone does not mean they will all be homosexual or bisexual. Rather, it's just an increase, right? Suggesting that these hormones are just one component of sexuality. And sorry, let me switch. In mammals, the default is a female. So all fetuses are female until prenatal androgens, such as testosterone. Testosterone is a type of androgen. Masculinize and defeminize the developing brain. But all developing fetuses are female, and then the male sperm has to produce that testosterone in order to masculinize that fetus, masculinize that brain, and then it becomes um, more male-like. And this might explain some characteristics of girls and women born with CAH. And truth is, genes influence sexual orientation in both men and women, as does prenatal environment. So prenatal environment, one of the examples is fraternal birth order effect on male homosexuality, which might be due to hormone levels in utero. So, for example, if fraternal birth order effect means that the more older brothers a man has from the same mother, the greater probability is that that man will be homosexual. So, if you are the firstborn son to a mom, what does a mom's body do when she has a male fetus who's producing testosterone? She has to produce estrogen, right? So she's trying to even out, because she's a female and she needs estrogen, right? So she's trying to even out her hormone levels by producing estrogen. And so then that son is born, and then she has another birth, and that she has another male fetus. So once she has another male fetus, she has to produce even more estrogen in order to even out the testosterone that boy is producing. And so now this boy is being exposed to much more um, levels of estrogen. And then this continues if it's a third or a fourth boy, right? So the more boys the mother has, the more likely the latest born boy is likely to be homosexual. Again, likely. There's no determinant. It's not 100%, but it is highly, it increases that number dramatically. But in reality, sexual orientation is actually much more flexible than we actually discuss, especially female sexual orientation, which is much more flexible than men in terms of sexual behaviors, identity, and attraction. So when we talk about sexual orientation, we're often only talking about like who someone is attracted to, right? But in reality, sexual orientation has three components: attraction, so who arouses you, right? To which sex or gender do people feel most attracted to sexually? Sexual behavior, which is which sex do people have voluntary sexual acts with? Voluntary being a keyword here, right? So you can imagine that somebody might have be attracted to males, but it is maybe socially taboo, and so you have sex with females, right? And your sexual identity is the third component, right? How do people describe themselves? Heterosexual, gay, lesbian, or bisexual? So you might be bisexual and have sex with an opposite sex because but you're more aroused by, the same sex, right? But this is the person that you chose to be with. And so this is the person you chose to have sex with. And so there's lots of combinations of these. It's not just, oh, sexual orientation is just one of these, right? Your sexual identity, or gay, lesbian, heterosexual, or bi, or queer, whatever it is. And not that I need to say this at all, but just in case I do, I want to make sure I mention that orientation is influenced by genetics, hormones, prenatal environment. It is not influenced in any way, shape, or form, literally by any study ever, by being raised by a gay parent, either parenting style. It's not influenced by sexual experimentation. It's not influenced by seeing gay people or seeing gay people together. And it's not influenced by just wanting to be gay. And the truth is, I'm not really sure why anybody cares because flexibility of human sexuality is huge. In reality, humans are aroused to a variety of stimuli. I can't look this up on my computer because it's a school computer, but if you just type in literally the word fetish, you'll get like 17,000 different categories of things because there are so many stimuli that different niches of people find to be attractive and arousing. And the majority of sexual behavior in humans is just for fun, right? Literally, Tinder made millions of it just by pairing people up in order to have casual sex. And I hope you enjoy my nod here to Tiger King. I'm not trying to show you any softcore porn or anything. This is an actual image of a throuple of if you haven't seen Tiger King, please do so at your earliest convenience because the show is insane. But nonetheless, these three men are married to one another in Oklahoma. And so, right, human sexuality goes beyond just one person with another person, and it goes beyond just sex to masturbation and different fetishes and a variety of sexual positions along with those different orientations. Okay, so that was our conversation about sex, and now we're going to talk about motivation in real life. So, the most applicable theory of motivation is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow, as the book discusses these sequence of needs, and these needs are uh, deprivations. Like so, they must be met, or else nothing can come after it. Right. So your basic needs must be met before higher needs can be satisfied or even attempted. And the goal is what he called self-actualization, which is this motivation to develop into our fullest potential, whatever that may mean. And so he built a little pyramid, kind of like a food pyramid, but much more applied. And so the first thing that you need to do to meet your needs is meet your physiological needs. Notice here, hunger, right? Hunger, thirst, sleep. These are your physiological needs. Without these things, you will die. Not surprisingly, these are related to homeostasis. So we can, instead of physiological needs, we can literally rename this regulatory drives, right? So if you're hungry, you cannot focus on meeting your fullest potential because your body is focusing on survival. So similarly, physical safety, right? Emotional safety. So first is physiological needs, hunger, sleep, thirst, and then you need to feel safe in your environment in order for you to progress to your next level and to meet your needs of love and belongingness, right? And love and belongingness is in terms of your family as well as in terms of your friends and your significant others. And then once you can feel love and belong in your family or your friends or in your life, then you can build on self-esteem and esteem for yourself, getting achievements, right? And his idea is that uh, you can't do that once if you don't know what love is, right? You can't love yourself if you've never experienced love. And then finally, you can reach self-actualization, which is your fullest potential, where you're just happy, you're achieving things, you're uh, uh, doing the things you're quote unquote supposed to do. And there is something to this because if you think about it, uh, children that are in poverty, that don't have access to food, um, don't do well in school. Why? According to this theory, it's because their physiological needs are not met. Or there's lots of research on Harlem in New York and how children, when their safety is low, they tend to not make good friendships and they tend to have really low self esteem. And the idea is that because they were not able to meet this need of safety, because Harlem is so dangerous, that they could never attain these two milestones. The other theory that explains motivation is self-determination theory. So self-determination theory does not necessarily focus on uh, voids, rather it focuses on growth. So it says that there are needs that are innate to an individual that are not necessarily due to a deficit. These are needs that we need regardless of whether we are at a deficit or not. We need these things in order to grow personally, not necessarily to fill a void. So we're motivated to achieve these three things. And so they are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. So competence is that we are motivated to essentially master something, that to succeed in whatever it is that we're doing, whether we uh, um, like it or not type thing, right? So we have this expectation of success from ourselves. And so even if we are succeeding, we still are motivated to reach this goal of competence. Same with relatedness, which is the need to belong, warm relationships with others, right? Along love and belongingness. And from this perspective, the self-determination theory, we don't just seek this out because we have a void of relationships with others. We seek it out even if we have a relationship with others, right? This is something that we do because we need it for growth. It's just stronger when we have a void. And then the third one is autonomy, right? Independence, self reliance, essentially being able to take care of yourself and handle things on your own and having control over your life. And so that's autonomy. And last but not least, we have intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And so this is most commonly used in terms of parenting and schooling. So intrinsic motivation is defined as something that you do for the sake of it, just for feeling good. And extrinsic motivation is when you do something because somebody essentially gave you either rewards or punishment. So we talked a little bit about this when we talked about operant conditioning, right? But if you give somebody rewards or punishments to incentivize their behavior, you are making their motivation no longer something about them, but rather external to them, hence extrinsic motivation. And so if every single time you finish your math homework like this, right, I give you $5, the next time you go to do your math homework and I say, oh, but there's no money this time, you might not do so well in your math homework anymore because you're not getting that extrinsic motivation. You're not motivated to do it. Intrinsic motivation is just doing it for the love of it because you just happen to love it for what it is. And so this is really the key to achievement. For long term, the best thing to do is to praise somebody like for good effort, for doing a good job, for persisting even when things are hard. That way, you're giving them motivation without switching the intrinsic motivation to extrinsic. And that's all we got. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll post part 3 in a little bit.